Hi, thanks for joining me on this video. This video is going to be mostly addressed to churches, and we're going to cover some basic radio stuff too in this video. But right now, churches are in a very, very unique situation with this whole virus thing going on and the prohibition against groups gathering together. Churches are looking for options to keep connected with their congregation. I mean, you'd have a church of 20, 30, 40, 50, 500, however many, gathering together every week, and now you're not allowed to because, one, government rules about gathering, but also because you don't want to spread this infection to other people, especially those who are in the higher risk category in the congregation. So many are turning to streaming, and we have a conversation with John Porterfield about that. But they're also turning into a concept called drive-in church. And it's where you drive into a parking lot and in some way the church will deliver the audio of the service to you in your car. And many churches are turning to FM radios and FM transmitters and using that delivery method. So we're going to talk about that here with Rob Branch. Rob is a consulting engineer who has helped me tremendously. He's one of my mentors. And I'm blessed with the privilege of being able to talk with Rob and getting his take on this whole drive-in church concept and situation and how it pertains to FM transmitters. A lot of them are turning to these things called Part 15 transmitters. And so we'll talk about that and some of the gotchas and just how to do it legally. Because a lot of people do things less than legally. So Rob, thank you again so much for joining me and having this conversation. I think we're in an interesting place right now with churches turning into this drive-in church concept. I've never heard of this concept before until all of a sudden you're not allowed to meet. And now all of a sudden, drive-in church here, and ignoring the fact whether they should be meeting or not in person because of health regulations.
Did this 20 years ago.
Yeah. But we didn't have a pandemic on our hands then. So ignoring the health aspect of that, a lot of churches have been talking about Part 15 transmitters and how do we do this? And I'm concerned, as I'm sure you are, that transmitter manufacturers aren't going to be vetting the people who are buying stuff. So people may be buying Part 15 transmitters. People might be buying actual FM transmitters.
The FM vetting happens a lot more if they buy from the manufacturers. You get questions when you're buying transmitters and they are not sure you're licensed. They'll ask for your call sign.
Ah, okay.
But
it's been a while.
On the smaller manufacturers, the ones you get on eBay, they don't ask very often.
Yeah. But so, a lot of churches don't know. And I'm kind of hoping that our conversation here is going to help some of our people that we have here locally who are looking at this. They've called us about, well, this is what we're thinking. What do I need? It's like, hang on.
True social distancing.
Yeah. So Part 15. I mean, I've seen the messages, on the bottom of random electronics. It says, this device is Part 15 compliant. It must accept interference. It must not cause interference. But what does it mean? I mean, as far as these Part 15 transmitters, I mean, what can we do?
I think we need to look at the original intent of Part 15. Part 15 was designed originally to prevent manufactured devices from interfering with other manufactured devices and over-the-air radio signals and television signals and other wireless mics. It's really a protection for the design of it was the protection for other devices that might be governed by the FCC, even in manufacturing or even licensing for licensed facilities, be that what it is, and including public service. I mean, the highest priority to the FCC is us interfering or prevention of interference with critical services. And if you might imagine, even in this time, those critical services are as important or more important than just about anything else on the radio, anything else over the airwaves. So we think in broadcast we're important, but to be honest with you, the police and the fire and the mobile and the hospital radios and interoperability is probably at this point, I think I could state, the most important thing going on, certainly for healthcare. And then and then probably second to that would be the information to the public on what's happening. So the FCC, these rules are designed and well designed not to interfere with public information. And the FCC in Part 15 differentiates between unintentional radiators and intentional radiators. So they understand that, you know, all electronic devices emit some type of RF energy. They all do. And, you know, from the beginning of radio and the spark gap transmitter all the way to the TV that you buy at Best Buy, they all emit some type of radio frequency energy. And Part 15 is designed and is written to prevent that energy from interfering with other entities and legitimate licensed entities in band, and then also any spurious energy. This is why we have transmission standards, because as we both know as broadcast engineers, not all broadcast transmitters that are type certified behave themselves and broadcast in their designed spectrum, and that can cause problems for others. So, so with respect to operation in the FM band, which is when I've been monitoring the correspondence, and the operation of the FM band seems to be what people are desiring to do. The FCC has less stringent standards about AM band emissions, but they are still pretty stringent. They just are allowed to have a radiator that can radiate as a physical device, and many times those radiators are buried or laid along the ground, leaky coax, things like that. I'm understanding for the scope of our talk today, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about emissions, as the FCC says, operation in the band 88 to 108 megahertz.
Right.
And so that's governed in the intentional radiator side, which is also what we're talking about, by 47 CFR section 15.239, and it's titled Operation in the Band 88 to 108 megahertz. And so the language might need some interpretation to the layperson, but we can go over it. It's really a pretty short section. We could go over this quickly. Emissions from the intentional radiator, that means an antenna or an antenna on the back of a transmitter, shall be confined within a band of 200 kilohertz wide, centered on the operating frequency. Same standards as FM broadcast in that way. That's talking about modulation. It's talking about how wide your signal is. So if you were to operate without a processor into a transmitter, you can overmodulate and literally and not comply with this regulation. The 200 kilohertz band, reading further in the FCC's regulations, the 200 kilohertz band shall lie wholly within the frequency range of 188 to 108. So you can't pick you can pick 107.9, but you can't pick something outside of that frequency range. It has to fall inside of it. And then Section B of the rule, the field strength of any emissions within the permitted 200 kilohertz band shall not exceed 250 microvolts per meter at 3 meters. The emission limit in this paragraph is based on the measurement instrumentation employing an average detector. To the average person, that means nothing, and most field strength meters would detect this. That's as opposed to a peak detector. The provisions in 15.35 for limiting peak emissions apply. Okay, so there's another rules section that refers to talking about limiting a peak emission in other parts of the band, spurious emissions, etc. So let's go back to that sentence, because that's the key sentence we'll talk about today. The field strength of any emissions within the permitted 200 kilohertz band shall not exceed 250 microvolts per meter at 3 meters. So somebody might say, well, look, so-and-so makes a 30-watt transmitter. I'll just put up a little antenna, a little whip antenna or something outside my church and put 10 watts into it. That's likely to go at least a mile or more in usable signal coverage. And the FCC has specified 3 meters at 250 microvolts. So for you metric system people, how much is 3 feet? 10 feet, okay? So at 10 feet, if you had a field strength meter, you'd have to measure 250 microvolts per meter. To us in broadcast, to give you an example of an average broadcast station, the station you work for, K-Wave, has a standard of 54 dBu. Okay, so that's 54 dBu. That's well over, or just under, actually, excuse me, just under 1 microvolt or 1 millivolt per meter. That's 1,000 microvolts per meter. 60 dBu is 1,000 microvolts per meter, which is the standard for some other broadcast radio stations, most of them in the country. So this is 1/4 of that as a standard for coverage. So the FCC is not saying, so 1 millivolt might actually go, let's just say, hypothetically, 1 meter or less, 3 feet or less. So your average FM signal that you're listening to on your car radio in Los Angeles is going to have far more signal than you could ever emit at 10 feet. That needs to be clearly understood. So it's not a matter of, and I've heard this argued before. This has come up to me as an engineering consultant, where I've heard this argued before that, well, what we'll do is we will put an antenna up, maybe on a short tower. We'll attach a transmitter to it, and we'll turn the power down till the usable signal doesn't exceed our property line. That has been an argument that has been indicated. The difficulty with that is the FCC controls and regulates the radiation, whether it's on your property or anybody else's. So operation for this purpose, it connotates the need to measure signal. Now, to my knowledge, there is no field strength meter. Field strength meters are very expensive. And so there is no field strength meter publicly available to measure these devices and measure the distance to the antenna. So we have a practical problem in even the knowledge that we may comply. I've heard it speculated that you could do 100 milliwatts or 10 milliwatts. Honestly, that depends on the antenna you use. If you use an antenna that's very inefficient, 10 milliwatts may be just fine. But there is no transmitter that I know made that actually will go low, go that low. Most transmitters, some transmitters will go 1 watt. Very old transmitters will do that. Most transmitters start at 10 watts, then go to 30 watts. These are under any reasonable radiator, these transmitters would not comply with this standard at all, and they couldn't be turned down low enough to comply with this standard. I wish I had better news, but it's just that way. And so everybody else understands this as well, because churches are in all kinds of different areas. Some churches are in rural areas, and if a tree falls in the forest, some might say that's not the right way to look at it in my view, but some may say, they're not near anything. They're not near anything they can interfere with because they're just in the middle of nowhere, rural Montana, let's say. And then some churches are very near fire stations and places, dispatch centers, and they may not even realize they're near it. So Section C of this, the field strength of any emissions radiated on any frequency outside of the specified 200 kilohertz band shall not exceed the general radiated emission limits in Section 15.209. Well, this is talking about, again, emissions outside of the 200 kilohertz area that it wants you to occupy, but it's also talking about areas beyond that, outside of the FM band. Well, the one thing that we know as engineers is, let's just say you try to turn your transmitter down that low. Well, I know several brands of transmitter that when turned down to the lowest possible thing, they're not even rated to operate this low. Let's say you turn a 10-watt transmitter down to 1 watt. What manufacturers know about those even type accepted transmitters for this purpose, for not this purpose, but for broadcast purposes, is that those transmitters become unstable and begin to broadcast on frequencies other than their own frequency that they're set to. They effectively malfunction. And in that malfunction, they very well could violate the provisions of this particular section. So let's go to D, because there is an interesting, it's not an exception, but it's an interesting provision, because the FCC, a lot of times what happens is not really churches wanting to do this, but schools wanting to do it. The school may have a campus that's 1 mile wide and 6 miles long. One of my clients is a school that's about 1 mile wide and about 6 miles long. In their campus, it's a large campus. They have accommodations for 15,000 students on the campus, as well as all their educational buildings and event centers. And this came up particularly with that school years ago. And, and the idea was, isn't there some provision for educational? Well, here's your part D is your provision for educational institute. It's saying that the intentional radiator, which really I think for this purpose means the antenna and the transmitter together as a system, need not be certified, provided the device complies with the standards of this part, and the educational institution notifies the Office of Engineering and Technology in writing in advance of operation, provided the following information. 1, the dates and places where the devices will be operated. So you're giving them a geographic location and dates. 2, the purpose for which the device will be used. 3, a description of the device, including the operating frequency, RF power output, and antenna. This is obviously for if they get a complaint from someone, they know where to look and don't have to go looking for you. And 4, a statement that the device complies with the technical provisions of this part, which is, for the most part, Section B, 250 microvolts per meter at 3 meters. So it assumes that you've measured it and that you've provided a statement that you've measured it and it complies, which you would have to have an engineer with likely a spectrum analyzer and a calibrated antenna in order to even do that. So, I don't want to, I'm playing politics here, but Section D was designed to scare educational institutions off from doing this because most of them don't have that equipment on hand.
I mean, I have a spectrum analyzer, but I don't have a calibrated antenna.
And you run a very powerful, you're the engineer for a very powerful radio station. Right. So you do have one on hand, but then every church that wants to do that is someone going to hire someone with this devices who, it's very likely, it's extremely likely that most engineers, broadcast engineers that you would call, have never been asked to do something like this in their career.
Yeah.
So yeah, right. But yet it is in the rules. Here's the rule. The other thing that happened, and this was years ago, there were also questions about whether this could be done in a prison, because there are some AM carrier current AM stations in prisons in the United States. And I'm not saying they're operating legally or illegally. I'm saying that they exist. And so I sent you, Marcos, a little while ago, a Part 15 decision by the FCC that basically was something the FCC, a clarification publication, public notice that was released in July 24th, 1991. And because this came up then, and the FCC actually said maximum effective radiated power, and they said 0.01 microwatts. That is not a measurable by most test equipment commonly available to even engineers today. That is not something that is easily measured. And in the effective radiated power is generated by antenna gain. So it's not the output of the transmitter. You could have an antenna gain of 2 times or 3 times with an antenna, let's say in a Yagi case, and you put 0.01 microwatts into it, even if you're able to measure it, and you violated the regulation. So they give an approximate maximum coverage radius. Now, this is not 250 microwatts because most, this 0.25 milliwatts, so that means that most common FM transmitters, stereo FM transmitters, will receive probably somewhere between 20 and 50 microwatts before they start to get too noisy to listen to. And if you're just directly over the air, not counting for multipath and all kinds of mountains and things, that's pretty much what they may do. The FCC is saying here the approximate maximum coverage radius is 200 feet. And they don't have any restrictions on your hours of operation because they're assuming that you'll cover such little ground that you won't care. So,
right.
So keeping in mind, if you say a maximum radius of 200 feet, and you look at the average church building, let's just say, when I say the average church building, we won't even limit this to Calvary chapels, although obviously you're interested in that. Let's just say,
sure.
You can't say the average church building. The Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa, that's inside the sanctuary. Okay, 200-foot radius is inside the sanctuary completely.
Yeah. I did have some Southern Baptist Church, the organization, contact us as well. They're interested in it. I'm like,
well,
hang on.
And let's be fair about this in terms of how this is used today, because there are places this is used today. I'm not saying that the operations are legal. I think that the FCC has set up the technical regulations such that it is extremely difficult to operate legally one of these and to prove that you're operating legally. Okay. And so that being said, where people see these the most, the transmitters the most, are in talking houses, where a realtor will go in, they'll put this transmitter inside a house, you'll pull into the parking lot or right up to the edge of the street, very well maybe, particularly in Southern California where their yards aren't very big, it very well could be, well within a 200-foot coverage radius of the house. Right. I have no way of knowing whether their operations are legal or not. What I do know is that this is in use in several areas where they'll pick an FM frequency that they don't think anybody is operating on. They will set this up in the house. There's no way they're notifying the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology of this. And they set it up while this house is for sale as an audio information on the house itself. Given this, I'm not, it's not for me to comment whether these rules are fair or not fair. Certainly given this situation, if the COVID-19 crisis or any other medical emergency that requires social distancing happens, it very well may be a very interesting idea. Us engineers have naysayed low power FM for the low amount of coverage they have, arguing that can they really provide a public service because their coverage is so low? And the low power operators would say, yes, we do provide the public service. And the full power operators would say, we couldn't even make a business work if we tried doing this because it's just not viable. Right. So that's not the argument. The argument here is, what is the function of micro power in these days? And, that's an interesting overall philosophical question. But yet, the Bible talks about obeying the rules and the laws of the land. And, the FCC does here, politically, the FCC does design rules so that there's no reasonable way you can follow them. But the reason they design those rules is to not interfere with others and so that it doesn't create work for themselves. The FCC is allowed by law to deny you from doing something because it doesn't create more work for them because their resources are limited. That is a legal reason that they're allowed to say they won't do something, is because it will create more work for them. So you can imagine if the FCC said, just operate with 10 watts out of an antenna at 20 feet or 30 feet. If they said that, then they would have to regulate that. And that means that they would have to, that if that interfered with critical public safety issues, they would have to mobilize to deal with that because that's what they're for. And
right.
And so
and when you said that, I was like, yeah, let's go back to that interfering with public safety aspect, because, even if it didn't create work for them just to try to regulate it, just the interference aspect of it. I mean, okay, there's the legal aspect of it, sure. But I mean, just the moral aspect of it, of you're interfering with somebody.
Certainly. And look, under restrictions, well, not restrictions of operation, but going back to the rules section for a moment, 15.239, the reason that Part D exists is because someone probably asked the FCC, and probably because this is actually codified in the regulations, someone influential probably asked the FCC, hey, we don't want to buy a transmitter that's type accepted for broadcast just to do this temporary thing. Can we get around that? And what the FCC said is, sure, you can get around that. Prove that it complies with the same regulations as a type accepted would, and notify us when you'll be operating. And you can operate provided that you comply with the standards in section B. And so, so that was obviously the reason they did it. So again, you're right. You want to follow the rules. And honestly, I think that there may be, I don't know how one would go about this. Maybe you and I can put our heads together about this, but there may be it may be where you go through a communications attorney and you present to the Office of Engineering Technology a setup that they would agree is approved. And that would require, this is engineering speak now, but that would require a lower powered transmitter or exciter or a section of a lower powered transmitter that may be put out, however, 0.01 microwatts or whatever that power level is, with enough RF attenuators to attenuate the signal so that any radiator they used, or only an approved radiator they use, would comply with the section of this. And that could happen. Now, the question is it going to happen? Would we get that through in the next month with the FCC and their limited resources and now everybody working from home? I seriously doubt it.
Probably not, yeah. And even the financial aspect of that.
Is that a viable idea? However, if there was that equipment, which obviously, as I mentioned before, the reason the FCC puts, there's a technical reason why they came up with 250 microvolts per meter at 3 meters. The technical reason is likely that they determined that that's what would interfere with someone else within that radius. Okay, so they determined that. Okay, and the rest of the rules section, in my mind, particularly section D, is the fact that this is impossible and we don't think anybody will ever do it legally. Okay, so that's effectively what they're saying in section D to educational institutes. And of course, this gives a loophole for educational institutes to even develop something like this. If it's a electrical engineering technology program that they have all the equipment and they could comply with it. Section D could very well be a EET project for an electronics school, were they inclined, back at the time when anybody even cared about FM radio in college. FM radio engineering in college. This would certainly be something that would be a fascinating experiment for a school to do. Okay, so if someone were to develop this past that in the manufacturing realm, go through the process of getting something type accepted, certified, type certified, as LPFMs are required to have, and then have this low a power level. And then really the technology would get expensive then if you were to synchronize these, because they could interfere with each other, or they could be at certain sections of a parking lot on different frequencies. But keeping in mind that, and again, big disclaimer, don't edit this out, this is not a license to do anything. And this is not a pass for anybody to experiment with this if they do not comply with the sections of this rule section. However, from a big idea standpoint, it's an interesting idea for people to, put a pole that would comply with, standards in a parking lot, as the FCC said, an effective radiated power of what they said, 0.1 microwatts, which is practically unmeasurable. I mean, 10 microwatts is the amount of signal in a marginal two-way radio arriving at the receiver front end. So this is a small amount of power.
That is, yeah.
Okay, so this is a very, very small amount of power, an unmeasurable amount of power in most scientific circles. So again, they intended for this rule to be a massive hurdle that nobody could jump through. However, a very inefficient radiator, a bad antenna, with a transmitter that's really a low power, and again, almost unmeasurable low power, may comply with this, but there's no way to know unless it can be measured. And that measurement equipment, the calibrated measurement equipment, is very expensive. The cheapest calibrated spectrum analyzer that I'm aware of that exists is in the range of about $2,000 that would be measurement grade enough for this. There are a few that are less than that, but their calibration and accuracy may be suspect.
So if a church did want to do something like a drive-in church, I mean, should this idea of using an FM transmitter of some sort or an AM transmitter of some sort just be...
Let's talk about the drive-in concept for a minute, because this is not just about radio. Radio is not the only medium that somebody could use in a parking lot to reach people socially distancing.
Right.
Drive-in theater speakers would be one.
And I'm sure there are some that are probably available.
Right. The point is that no market has, there's not a lot of market for speakers mounted on the side of a car watching a movie. But theoretically, to be frank with you, by the time you got done measuring all of this, you might want to purchase a, akin to a jumbotron in a parking lot with a set of speakers that mounts to a window effectively, or for that matter, and this is the other problem with this, we're trying to solve a problem that really doesn't exist, because everyone streams. So who doesn't have a phone, and the savvy ones connect their phone to their car and they're streaming. So if they go to the church and on a sunny day, if the preacher wants to stand on a stage outside and somebody in the car listen, they can stream and hear that preacher preach. There's a little bit of a delay, but they could use a low latency streaming and stream there. I mean, the ability for this mass distribution already exists, and exists in much more of a higher tech way than could ever be developed under this rule section.
Yeah, I mean, I think streaming, there's no licensing, that you would have, regulatory licensing you'd have to go through.
You're not paying royalties, right?
Right. I think that is a more cost-effective way of getting that content out. And
it's commercially available and it's legal.
Right, exactly. All of the above.
Right. So I mean, there are a lot of ways that we have technology that when this rule section was crafted, which let's talk about the state of the internet when this unlicensed Operation Public Notice was released, 1991. I believe that was the year that I had my very first Windows 3.0 computer, and I connected to the internet by modem, and I was the only person at the college that now has 300 full-time IT employees. I was the only person at that college to have a computer connected to the internet because they didn't believe in it at the time. And so what I'm saying is that the FCC regulation does not keep up with the times at all. Okay,
right.
It keeps up with demand. It keeps up with the cellular demand, the cutting edge technology. But in terms of all government regulation, none of it keeps up with cutting edge technology. Most of the regulators are the slowest adopters to technology.
And there's so many things kind of deviating from the conversation, a little bit of part 15, but we're seeing a lot of stuff in broadcast industry. This MDCL is still kind of in that gray area where it's okay, but it's not.
Oh no, it's not officially
permanent. Yeah.
It's done on an experimental basis, right?
But there's a lot of stations doing it, and they've gotten permission, but they had to jump through different hoops. HD radio is still kind of in its infancy still, even though it's been around for almost 20 years.
It's not been adopted by the receiver manufacturers. Otherwise, it's reasonably ubiquitous, or it would be if it was widespread.
Right.
Well, and understand this too, and this is what I would encourage somebody to do. You know, none of us are past scrutiny, and I always encourage, if I have a client in broadcast, I will encourage them to get second opinions that are qualified, not a second opinion that's anecdotal or someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. But if you get a second opinion that's qualified, do it. That's fine. Go ahead and get that. What you need to know is that what we've pointed you to today are the standards by which you have to comply in order to do FM broadcast unlicensed. You have to do that. So the release that the FCC gave in 1991 and the current rule section, part 15.239, section 15.239 in Title 47, CFR Title 47, these are the standards, and you can read them. They're available for anybody to read. And if you don't understand these standards, the right question to ask is not, why can't I do this? The right question to ask is an expert in interpreting these rules for you. And if they come to a different conclusion and they are qualified to come to that conclusion, then then my suggestion is, this is another suggestion I would make, is talk to a communications attorney about this. Talk to an FCC expert in the law. I'm a technical expert, but there are legal experts on this that also have run across this. Many communications attorneys in the United States. I can name any number of names who could be called. Most Calvary Chapel entities, but many other entities might know somebody who runs a radio station, like you, Marcos, who is an engineer for a radio station, who could refer them to legal counsel to have a question. Lots of churches have less to risk than others, and I'll just say this as a plug. One of the things that qualifies me to be an expert in this is that one of the things I do as a consultant is go to New York City and track down one of the 100 unlicensed radio stations in New York City that are interfering with the licensed radio stations in New York City. That it is a cat and mouse game to find these people and to report them and to communicate with them about how they're violating regulations. So I work on this as an expert from the other end. I am contracted by a couple of groups to go into the city, drive around New York, and find these people who are interfering with the legitimate broadcast stations. And they're not even close to trying to comply with these regulations. They're doing this with impunity. And the FCC has recently increased fines to the hundreds of thousands of dollars for those people who violate those rules with impunity, which is what is happening in New York. Do I believe somebody would be fined that way for violating this regulation? It's not for me to say. It's for the FCC's enforcement and regulation to say. But but
that option is there for them to do.
The option is there for them to do.
Yeah.
And the nightmare scenario is not doing it in a vacuum. The nightmare scenario is accidentally, unintentionally interfering with somebody who's in public service or safety or airport safety, FAA and airport safety. Those are the things that make the FCC very excited to get out to a facility in 24 hours, investigate, and ultimately find someone or charge them with crime. And so that's the issue that you end up with. The other thing that's very important to understand, and this is another very important point, because I know a number of the people who have talked about this are in the state of New Jersey, for instance. In many states, unlicensed FM operation is also a crime. So in the state of New Jersey and the state of New York, I believe in the state of New Jersey, it's a felony the first time. In the state of New York, it's a misdemeanor the first time, I believe, and a felony the second time. So understanding that there pirate operations where you're really trying to serve a larger number of people than a parking lot, if somebody really got that in their mind to do, or if they ended up interfering with someone, the same rules would apply. Rule violations would apply. Understanding that state law also applies. In some states that were the legislators were trying to discourage this practice.
Wow, a felony.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Well, thank you, Rob, for taking a few minutes. I really appreciate it. I mean, you have a lot more expertise than I do on this, so I appreciate your expertise.
And and if anyone wants to call me and discuss this technically further, who thinks that they can do this, I mean, certainly open to listening to ideas. I'm not the Federal Communications Commission. I can't tell you what they would or wouldn't do in situations. What we know is we know that the FCC has regulations, and we know that they have a history of enforcing those regulations in a certain way. And so that is generally how you want to comply with those regulations, is based on how the FCC interprets those. And so, if someone wants to have further conversations about this, and then of course the other thing, if you want to think about the long game, is which I'll put a plug in for my company in my consultancy. If you want to think about the long game, then buy a radio station. If you're a church that can't be reached in a parking with a 200-foot radius with one of these in a parking lot, then maybe you're a church big enough to actually own a FM broadcast radio station, and quite possibly, one may be available for sale. And these days, not a lot of new radio stations are getting licensed by the FCC, but there's certainly a vibrant transaction community of owners who decide not to own radio stations and decide to purchase them. And so maybe you won't do it for this crisis, but maybe for the next one or the next one, you may have a voice in the community that could be vibrant in that community and serve far more people that attend the church that someone pastors. And really become a community force. And that's certainly what K-Wave's done. Many of the churches that I've helped out over the years in the ministries, that's what they've done. And it's really opened a whole new door for them of ministry to people who would never be able to set foot in their church. But yet lives are changed as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. It's getting late. I have to go home. I'm getting text messages here.
Okay.
But thank you, Rob. Again, this was really. Every time I talk to you, I just learned so much.
Well, no problem, Marcos.
Thank you.
And we learned from each other.
Well, let me know if I ever teach you anything, because I don't think it.
Oh, you have.
How not to do things, maybe. So I want to give a huge thank you to Rob for taking some time and talking to me about this topic, because this topic is one that there's a lot of anecdotal information out there, but to actually get the facts and to actually get real information and looking at the FCC regulations, this was very, very helpful. Rob, thank you very much. Again, I always learn so much when we have these conversations. If you want to get a hold of Rob because you're thinking about buying a radio station, let me know. I'll get you in touch with him. And, you might be the next broadcaster that comes up on the air. But if not, and this was just for informational, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. My goal is to make sure that you have the information with these series of videos, is that you have the information to do church through this time, this national emergency crisis time with the COVID-19 coronavirus situation that's going on right now. Unprecedented times, and that might require outside of the box thinking. And as far as this box is concerned, with using FM transmitters to broadcast to a drive-in church, well, I don't think it's technically feasible. So Part 15, transmitters. Okay, what else is there? We talked with John Porterfield just the other day about streaming, and if you didn't see that video, well, it's going to be right up here on the card. Go watch that. We start talking about streaming and some of the options that you have available. But that is an option. Having a PA in the parking lot, that is an option. Again, we are not touching the topic of whether or not you should be gathering as far as health regulations. Again, we are supposed to be socially distancing so that way we do not pass this virus. Is Part 15, is FM radio the right thing? Probably not. That's what I'm taking away from this. So let's look at other options. Streaming. It's there. It is an option. Thank you, Rob, for coming on. Thank you for talking to me about this. Great conversation. So much information. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, watch some of the other ones. There's other things that are going on here. And if you want to know more, subscribe, click the thumbs up, all the YouTube thingies that we ask you to do. But I'm just asking you to watch more videos because there's some fun things in there. All right. We will see you in the next video. Stay safe. Stay healthy.